biology, many different, discipline, not just in philosophy. They try to reformulate the philosophical concept through this one. It's a new concept, which actually borrowed from different fields, right? So I think this is the way in which they try to weaponize philosophy. And then they try to give the kind of philosophical weapon to the radical movement. It's very same, very similar projects, the Lukács and then other and the so-called Western Marxists did, before. In this sense, I try to locate, the Deleuze in the genealogy of this kind of Western Marxism. Is what I want to say. Of course, it doesn't mean actually the Deleuze is the Western Marxist. I don't say like that because Deleuze is really critical of a certain the Hegelian Marxism. But anyways, there might be actually, the difference. It's not just a minor difference. It's not quite, the fundamental difference. But
Yeah.
So in this sense, I would say minor communism means, we must accept the different, the communism, different communism. And then, but different communism aims at one single, universal goal. Why is that this universal goal? That is what? Abolishment of state. I think that is a really crucial message we can read in Anti-Oedipus and Thousand Plato. In Thousand Plato, actually, the Anti-Oedipus and Thousand Plato, they proposed the concept, very important concept, was Urstaat. And then they actually actually wrote the meaning of a state, and then they actually criticize the kind of the evolutionary idea of a state. Even this idea the shared by this evolutionary sense of the state development shared by the Marxism, the Orthodox Marxism and the liberalism. Very strangely, they shared. So that's why just the state came to exist, through what? Development of productivity, something like that. But Deleuze and Guattari actually criticize this traditional sense of, the state. State actually does not exist as, the consequence of the kind of development of productivity. That means historical development didn't bring in the actual state. So state is accidentally came to exist. And then kind of a declaration, is symbolic declaration. It's like a pure signifier, just like that, produced by the kind of political experience. The Deleuze actually discussed it in the logical sense very clearly when he discussed Robinson Crusoe. Law is just imposed on life. The life cannot, the law cannot experience life. That means actually the law is imposed on life, and then it caused what? Certain confliction and some tension. And then always, in this sense, the law always fail, okay? Law always fails. And then life, is always resist this imposition of the law, on its own movement. So that is, according to Deleuze, revolution. In this sense, Deleuze emphasized revolution is necessary. But problem is, we don't want to pursue this revolution. That is a Deleuzian sense of politics. So actually always people, we want to be fascist rather than communist. That is what Deleuze says. That's what Guattari said. We are quite easy to be fascist rather than communist. You understand? This is actually point, because we don't want to actually some neighborhood. Sorry, actually, which has that kind of differences, different color and different culture, different taste and different opinion, different religion. We don't like them. So actually, we wanna actually is a stabilized, very peaceful neighborhood without this different neighbor. I think very clear idea. That's why actually the Deleuze and Guattari's the political agenda is to create people who are not fascist. That is their political project, and that is, in my opinion, the meaning of minor communism. You should actually take home.
No, that's really well articulated, and I think that'll enhance, especially for our audience, which is quite diverse and from the third world. Getting into my next question, the third world in your book is not simply a region or an alliance of post-colonial states. It names the anti-colonial political force that interrupts both the Cold War and the authority of major communism. And I guess my question is, once states formed in the name of the third world liberation can themselves operate within global capitalism, where does the revolutionary force of the third world continue to reside?
Yeah, good question. Is when I put down this term in my book, and then some friend, didn't like it because they thought the third world is quite the European oriented concept. But actually, the thing is that lose the third world this term as concept. It didn't use actually this term as a sort of a definition of a certain region. He used this one as concept. He's in his the books about cinema 1 and cinema 2. He discussed the meaning of the third word, and then he quoting many from the Kafka and then some other, the African the movie and then something like that. So, as far as I understand, I might be wrong, but actually the a third world is not third world does not exist. Is according to Deleuze, That's why I said it's not a regional term. It's not a certain the definition to indicate a certain the region. It's not a geopolitical term, but rather at some point maybe if you like it might be aesthetic term something like that or some. It's not quite ontological. It's an aesthetic term. So why? Because Deleuze emphasized there. The third world must be created. It's a third world might be created, and the third world exists as some exists something cannot be captured by representation. That means it might be some called anti-representation, but it doesn't mean actually a certain sense of anti-representation, but it's sort of a remnant. Some actually remains. The dominant narrative, try to represent something, but something is missing. The missing within the kind of narrative, something must be missing in the frame of the kind of representation. That is what I mean. Actually, the meaning of third world. And this is third world. Sometimes indicate this kind of the concept of third world as a certain third world zone. Third world zone, and then some zone of a third world, something like that. Zone. That means kind of zone is what I mean. Actually, the sort of some gestalt, if you like, is some sort of some hegemony feels, something like that. We can translate it. It's not the exact translation, but in my opinion, similar to this one. But in Deleuzian sense, it might be actually the equal to his early concept of a nonsense. His early concept of nonsense. So that means actually something existing as a certain deformed the nonsense, but which actually can is produced sense. That means if you wanna make a sense of something, and then you need what nonsense prior to this kind of sense. That is what the delusion says. So it's sort of in this sense. So the word actually what is must be created through this kind of sense. So that is at some point is in my opinion is a body without organ. It's very similar to the concept, body with the organ. That means actually this body with the organ is really Marxist term.
Yeah.
That the Marx is this one.
Yeah. This also brings the book in the present. A critique of Western imperialism can easily become an attachment to any state power positioned against the West, a politics often defended today through campism. Does communism in a monarchy offer an internationalism organized through anti-colonial and emancipatory struggles rather than allegiance to competing states? So yeah, that is a good question. If I try to answer it, I would say the third word, actually third word is not a certain original, the term. Deleuze would propose, the third word is way in which we can find out the possibility of the resistance. Is actually that I would say Deleuze didn't say that, we must organize people to resist imperialism, something like that. But what he tried to say is that imperialism is already internalized in the modern world. He was following Lenin's concept of imperialism. So capitalism as such is imperialist. So
as far as capitalism, sustains, imperialism wouldn't go away. That's what he said. So in this sense, actually, I want to emphasize 2 points. First one is revolution is necessary. Revolution is always there. The possibility of revolution always, but we don't take it. We don't want to, take revolution seriously. We don't want to actually join this revolution, or we don't want to actually, revolutionize the world. That is his point. Another one is actually he discussed this one is when he engaged in Robinson Crusoe. The Robinson Crusoe story, actually, because of Marx already analyzed, the narrative, Robinson Crusoe. That is, I think, the traditional as a Marxist theme. Even Althusser discussed Robinson Crusoe, and then Marx said Robinson Crusoe is about the mirror image of a bourgeois class. Okay, and then Althusser also the dominant ideology could be called Robinsonade. It's the bourgeois story. It's Elon Musk and all like the like Robinson Crusoe, but Deleuze also wrote about Robinson Crusoe, and then his point is quite different from the Marx and the Althusser. And he said, the people said, even Karl Marx said, what is Robinson Crusoe arrived in Ireland, and then he emphasized, this the ascending, the bourgeois class, developed, the island, primitive island, and then the island turned into civilized, and then at some point, Marx accepted that one, that necessary process. Bourgeois came and then the civilized that islands. But against this traditional understanding of Robinson Crusoe from the perspective of Marxism, Deleuze, the emphasize it's not the island which was the transformed by Robinson Crusoe, but what Robinson Crusoe himself was transformed by the island.
Yeah,
that is the point. So actually, we actually always focused on how imperialists came and then changed, this world. No, that world was not so good in those days. Modern intellectual, modern revolutionary wanted to change our society. Think about the 19th century, 20th century. Much of, the democratic, the actual demand from the bottom. What? Try to change actually their own country in this area. Asia, think about it. South Korea, Southeastern Asia, and China, they try to abolish, establish the order. It doesn't mean actually imperialists just simply came, empty the place, and they actually civilized this area. It's a wrong story. As part of it is cannot resist actually their own transformation when they actually, came here and occupied. Carl Schmitt the hypothesis, the Carl Schmitt presupposition is imperialism is the expansion of European territory, something like that. I think they wouldn't be actually correct from the perspective of Deleuze. More like what is they came here and they also transformed without the colonized world. That means without Asia. Think about without Pakistan, without actually the other the Middle East country. Think about that. How actually could Europe exist? That means actually think about nowadays because of this Trump-Iranian war. What happened? They actually suffered from actually shortage of gas, energy. It showed that how actually these Western world exists, how this so-called imperialism can be sustained.
Yeah.
Because of this so-called colonized world. In Deleuzean sense, it's so-called the third world. But third world totally forgotten, underestimated, and then kind of the taking a certain vintage point. But that is according to Deleuze, what the world as such.
I want to bring together your treatment of desire, organization, and the state. In Anti-Oedipus, a movement can declare revolutionary interests while remaining invested in obedience and repression. Through Guattari's idea of transversality, you also return to democratic centralism as a relation that must be transformed rather than abandoned. And in your account of the proletarian state, power established in the name of communism can defer communism indefinitely. How does minor communism organize collective force without allowing the party or the state to capture the revolution it claims to advance?
So, there is some misunderstanding. The Deleuze-Guattari's political position is anarchism, something like that. But nowadays, this misunderstanding is really, really actually weaker, in my opinion, because actually the most works actually now the translated in English actually that this kind of misunderstanding in the Anglophone word is gradually fading away. But the early, the reception in the Anglophone word, you can find out that they try to explain the Deleuze and Guattari's, the political thought as anarchism, something like that. But I don't think actually the Deleuze and Guattari is anarchism. Anarchism is more like, of course, actually they shared many ideas with anarchism, but they had very clear idea of state. It means it doesn't mean that they agree with state. They don't agree with staticism. State is not necessary. That's why they said state is not necessary, but the state came to exist. That is our dilemma. So that is actually one point I try to make. Another one is they also had some, in my opinion, very realistic strategy to fight against this kind of staticism. Is a party. They also had the idea of party, but a quite different sense, from the other people's, think about party. It means a centralized party. But they didn't reject, the concept of party, but, they reformulated, actually the Lenin's sense of a party is Bolshevism. I think, in my opinion, they made, the Bolshevism as a real Bolshevism. The Bolshevism means, the majority, just the universal one. But minor communism is like that. Minor communism means actually the number is small, the value, and then that political, actually the how can I say political, actually, the influence is universal. Mm-hmm. You understand? That is a Bolshevism. So I think the Deleuze actually clarified this idea is when he wrote a preface to Guattari's book, Psychoanalysis Transpeciality, and then he wrote that one. Is there as Guattari emphasized the group subject. So that is based on Guattari's practice, the schizoanalysis. Schizoanalysis in this sense, in the way in which you can produce. Quite unlike psychoanalysis is I think later Lacan quite share a similar idea with the concept of schizoanalysis when he emphasized psychosis, all right. So in this sense, the schizoanalysis is not just therapy, but rather kind of a political technology in the Marxian sense. In the Marxian sense, the natural technologies, Marx already talked about how an animal produced, the organ as a natural technology to adapt their own life, to the environment, something like that. That is natural technology. And then Marx put a distinction between historical technology and the natural technology, right? So historical technology kind of a party. And then that means Deleuze and Guattari more elaborated this Lenin's concept of Bolshevik party. Now, Lenin said, what is the party? What is to be done? He discussed the function of a party. He said, party is kind of platform by which the party members shared, illegal knowledge. In our term, in contemporary term, I think we can translate this actually the idea into information. Kind of a secret information must be shared by this platform. And what kind of secret information? That's why actually Lenin was interested in publishing Iskra, is the newspaper in those. That is up-to-date technology, in those days, up-to-date media to spread the kind of revolution idea, secret idea of revolution. Something like that. So, or illegal idea or illegal information means what is some kind of struggle to fight against that kind of established order. So that is actually the meaning of the party, all right? So, and then Deleuze Guattari said actually that kind of centralized the party no longer workable, but because